Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Friday, the 23rd of May, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Let's go ahead and jump into today's domestic sit rep. Starting with some news coming out of the FCC. Robert, I'll just let you take it away.
Good morning, Mike. So the Federal Communications Commission announced yesterday that they're passing new rules, and they say the intention is to block Chinese government and other adversary efforts to what they say is assert control over U.S. wireless equipment certification. The FCC said they had conducted a review of currently approved test labs, and these are labs that test the electromagnetic compatibility of wireless devices, everything from cell phones to things like pacemakers. And they said after this review, a number of labs that have been approved previously by the FCC to test these devices and certify them had ties to the Chinese Communist Party or are involved with the Chinese People's Liberation Army. So the FCC is now attempting to block these labs so that the Chinese government effectively will have little to no access, I think they're thinking hopefully over the certification of U.S. wireless devices.
Please continue.
And the Texas Railroad Commission warned oil companies in the Permian Basin that wastewater from fracking is causing widespread increases in underground pressure. And they said this wastewater is actually breaching old oil wells and is threatening to contaminate drinking water for both people and animals. And they said they're going to impose new limits on water pressure levels starting next month. And they're going to require oil companies to also assess old oil wells within a half a mile of fracking wastewater disposal sites. And the National Weather Service said that there's a 60% chance of an above normal hurricane season in the U.S. this year. And they said they're expecting 6 to 10 hurricanes, and 3 to 5 of those could be Category 3 or above. And they said their prediction is based on higher sea surface temperature, which they say can act as fuel for stronger storms, and lower wind shear, which would typically weaken storms. And then
Hey, Robert, just briefly here. I don't think the National Weather Service has an incredible track record in being able to determine the exact number of storms, obviously. However, we have heard in previous weeks that there is some concern that FEMA may not be ready for a couple reasons. Number one, the acting director was fired just a couple weeks ago. But number two, FEMA's plan, didn't you report on this the other day? This FEMA 2.0 plan, they want to push a lot of this disaster response down to the states. And what we're hearing from states, they're just saying, we are not ready. So if you are on the Gulf Coast or the Atlantic seaboard, consider making additional preparations here for hurricane season, just in case FEMA, well, I mean, let's be honest. I think we can look at the hurricane in North Carolina and say, FEMA probably could have done more. However, this may be an especially disruptive disaster response due to what's going on at FEMA. Any other points there you want to make?
No, I think that's the most important point here is that I think his name's David Richardson is the new FEMA director. They just renewed those contracts that we covered for what they call their core employees, which are the contractors for disaster response. And yeah, if this does get pushed down to the state level, the states are already basically panicking over the potential to have to pay 5% of SNAP, for example, or some of these other entitlements that are being pushed down to the state level. Mm-hmm. And I've seen also a couple of, in addition to rolling back some of these entitlements for illegal immigrants in California and Illinois. So some of those states like California are also reversing major, like tens of billions of dollars programs that have been touted for years because they need those to make up budget shortfalls. So I think they're going to have a problem actually making up this disaster response at the state level because the funding is probably just not there.
Certainly, but I think it's something that has to be done. So the only way out is through. And then finally here, let's end on this power potential in the Southwest thermal. The Trump administration has come out over the past few months now, and they say we want to reindustrialize the United States and bring back jobs in manufacturing and tech and AI and build the data centers and do all these great and wonderful things. But the fact of the matter is the United States just does not have the juice to make it happen. So the Trump administration said they want to add 100 gigawatts of power to the national electricity generating capacity. And what maybe they found it here in the Mountain West region.
That's right. This is the Great Basin of Nevada, and it reaches out into the neighboring states around Nevada, including California, Arizona, and Utah. And the U.S. Geological Survey, they released an assessment yesterday, and they're saying that 135 gigawatts of power potential is present in this basin, and this could produce electricity equal to 10% of the total current U.S. power supply, which they say currently, according to the USGS, only accounts for less than 1% of all U.S. electricity generation. So this is another option that the Trump administration could go toward to make up that power shortfall. From what I understand, there's also been a big push on the SMR front, the small modular nuclear reactor front, trying to get these permitting reforms done. So I think this is one way they could go. Now, from what I understand, though, on this site, it is not the easier form of geothermal power where you have permeable rock and heated water comes through, and that's used to generate power. This is impermeable rock, so it requires a bit more of a technological investment. So that it's probably a longer term and more expensive process to get that 135 gigawatts of power. But if we need it, I don't think the Trump administration necessarily has the choice to not try to get federal and state level investment in this project.
Mm-hmm. All right, yeah, and maybe some of that Saudi and Emirati money is going to flow into this stuff. All right, thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on to today's global sit rep. Good morning, Jared. Starting off in South Korea.
Good morning. So there were a bunch of rumors yesterday that the American military was going to remove up to 4,500 of the 28,000 troops it's got stationed over in South Korea. And the South Korean Ministry of Defense came out and said, that's absolutely not happening. There are no talks about this. We're not discussing this in any way. However, there is still discussion between South Korea and the United States on how to cover the cost of maintaining that troop presence. So I do think that it will remain under the limelight. Moving over to to Europe, the Polish Prime Minister, pictured here, he said that the Polish armed forces are checking for explosives on an undersea power cable between Poland and Sweden. And this was after yesterday the Polish armed forces drove away a sanctioned Russian ship that they claimed was performing suspicious maneuvers near the cable. So they're expecting some kind of attack potentially. We should find out later today whether or not they actually found anything. Staying in the EU, a group of 9 EU member states are presenting a letter to the EU Court of Human Rights to completely reinterpret their law that actually hinders them from expelling foreign criminals. And this is a minor note, but it is part of a much larger trend that we've been covering here, where the EU is pushing back against mass migration. They're trying to actually start getting a lot of people out that have come in the last 10 years. And the reason that's really important for the U.S. is twofold. First off, it takes off international pressure for President Trump to do the same thing here. So as long as our allies are not pushing on us, hey, don't do that because we're doing the same thing, cool. But more importantly, this should create a more cohesive Europe, which allows a more cohesive and stable Europe, which allows the United States to fully focus on the Asian Pacific going forward. And then, speaking of the Asian Pacific, Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba finished this round of trade talks with the United States, and he's promising that in the interim between this round and the next round, he will promote Japanese investment into the United States. Now, during these talks, there were a couple of headlines floating the idea of Japan investing in U.S. steel, potentially to get the Nippon Steel deal through. So I think that's going to come back. I think that's going to come back up. We'll probably see an investment either way, just because that will help reduce the deficit. I am keeping in mind that this also will be subject to Japan's burgeoning economic crisis that you covered earlier this week. We have to see how all that plays out.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that update, Jared. Let's go ahead and move on to some of our warning items here. So this shooter in D.C. That killed 2 individuals outside of a Jewish event previously had released somewhat of a manifesto. They call it a manifesto. It's pretty short, but Unity of Fields is the umbrella group that is trying to basically lead the pro-Palestine movement in the United States. They see themselves as an umbrella group, at least. And so they released a more formal manifesto. They call it a zine, which is a short for magazine. This manifesto of Elias Rodriguez, this alleged shooter involved in, I believe it was Wednesday night, the shooting in D.C. It's not much of a manifesto. It's pretty short, but the author does recount the death toll against Palestinians in the ongoing Israel-Gaza war. He discusses some cases of political violence, and he ultimately arrives at his point by saying the Israeli, quote, perpetrators and abettors have forfeited their humanity. So the author in this manifesto equates his armed action. So this was written prior to, so this was premeditated. He said these events are mostly, quote, theater and spectacle. So he seemingly acknowledged that his action would be symbolic and really have no direct effect on ending the war. But as you can see from the cover here, Bring the War Home has been a central message among the pro-Palestine movement here in the United States and more broadly in the West, basically saying bring the war for Palestinian liberation home, so that U.S. activists can be actors there. Earlier this year, I did outline 5 potential courses of action for far-left groups and autonomous, sporadic acts of domestic terror, and this is obviously a case of domestic terror, but specifically targeting infrastructure, political officials, or symbolic targets, was the second most likely course of action. Number 1 was just maintaining the status quo, which we have seen the Antifa groups do. We've seen some very limited black bloc demonstrations, very limited direct action. For the most part, they are not ramping up and have not ramped up their operations. So I said maintaining the status quo, which they're doing, was the most likely. The second most likely right behind that is sporadic domestic terror. Potentially, we're on the cusp of something like that. Something like the Luigi Mangionis and the Elias Rodriguez. We could obviously see this continue, and I would say that's probably the most likely course of action from here. In addition to just protests, I think coming up on Saturday, there's another national day of protest among Palestinian pro-Palestine groups. Obviously, we could see violence. And then coming up on June 14th, there's the next big national day of protest by Indivisible and 5051 and related groups. On a related note, your area study is mission critical to your security and your ability to prepare for future events. So if we do see armed violence, an assassination, or other forms of shootings become a common tactic pursued by far left groups, the best thing that you can do right now is to gauge your area's risk of those type of events. And these will be sporadic and fairly low likelihood on any given day, extremely low likelihood on any given day for the average person. But you should be identifying far left political and social groups in your area. So I encourage you to do some homework this weekend and identify whether your area has political parties like the Party for Socialism and Liberation, PSL. Talked about them many times. I would even wrote Democratic Socialists of America, DSA, in there. Talked about them many times. The Antifa affinity groups, other communist, social, and left-wing anarchist groups. Just identify if you have a presence in your area, because awareness is the first step, and that's why we do an area study. On that note, you are not alone in feeling like you could or should be doing more to prepare for the future. If you've ever considered becoming the intelligence officer for your area's disaster response efforts, or if you could see yourself as taking a leadership role in your community, then special projects might be for you. I'm holding an information session that's coming up on Thursday, the 29th of May at 7 p.m. It will be recorded, but you should attend live. And I will describe what you can get out of this intelligence and security training membership. And registration details will be in next week's report all week long. And with that, let's go ahead and move on to Robert. Welcome back. All right. So this guy, Jamie Raskin, Democrat from Maryland, wants to move the U.S. Marshals Service over to the judicial branch.
Yeah, they're calling this the Marshals Act, and it would remove the U.S. Marshals Service from the executive branch into the judicial branch, and then place the authority to appoint the different district marshals and the head U.S. Marshal into a board that's composed of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, at this current point, Roberts, and the Judiciary Conference, which is basically a body of all the chief judges from each district, each circuit, and a handful of different district level courts. And this is not going to pass the current Congress, but Jamie Raskin, his comment on it, he said this was necessary to, quote, fortify the independence of the judicial branch. And I think this bill is a precursor to a major power grab that would remove an executive branch check on the federal courts, because the typical process is that if the federal court wants to, arrest somebody for contempt or issue a warrant, it has to go to the U.S. Marshal Services, which then enforces that warrant. If they were moved in under the judicial branch, well, there would be no way for the executive branch to tell the U.S. Marshal Service not to enforce that warrant, removing that check on the federal courts. And I think if the Democrats flip the House and Senate in 2026, they could, I think, in the Senate legislative filibuster to push this bill through with a simple majority. And I think, obviously, pretty clearly the goal to remove one of the law enforcement agencies from the executive branch that would be able to serve as a check on the judicial branch, undermining the Article 2 powers of the White House, of the presidency. And considering the comments that Democrats have made over the last couple of months about extraordinary tactics and what they've been pushing in order to undermine the Trump administration and the Republican governing trifecta, I think it's likely that they would do this if they are able to successfully get a majority in the House and Senate by even one seat.
Mm-hmm. All right. So currently, the Marshal Service is under the Department of Justice, and it responds to the Attorney General. Under this Raskin plan, you said there's kind of like a panel.
It's basically a board that's made up of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and the Judicial Conference, which is like the governing body for the federal courts. Okay. And they would be basically at the top of the chain of command for the Marshal Service. And the specific, I read through parts of the bill, and the specific language they change is to remove the authority of the Attorney General over the U.S. Marshal Services, and then basically make it so that that the Attorney General has to request cooperation from the U.S. Marshals if they want them to do anything outside of direct command of this new board.
Okay, so here's a good question. So activist judges would have enforcement capabilities. One obvious scenario is you have one of these judges that rules this individual in the Trump administration violated the Constitution, broke federal law, whatever he or she would be accused of, and now this activist judge could potentially attempt to sic the U.S. Marshal Service on this Trump administration official. I'm sure there are other barriers and regulations, and it has to be approved by the Chief Justice or approved by this board. But is that what we're talking about here? I
think so, and it's being pushed under the guise of increasing security for the federal judiciary. I think Eric Swalwell, the California Democrat, has also been pushing this bill. There's multiple co-sponsors. Raskin is the main co-sponsor of this bill, and all the hearings that I've read, the comments I've read from different hearings on this bill discussing this has been. They are saying that the court needs basically its own organic law enforcement in order to ensure its security, physical security, because of growing threats to federal courts. But I think that is a smokescreen basically for giving these district level courts and the circuit courts their own law enforcement agency where they can do exactly that. They can say the Trump administration is in contempt of court for continuing deportations, even though a district court issued a nationwide injunction, and now we're going to give them a warrant and they're going to go arrest the border czar Tom Homan or some other Trump official.
Mm-hmm. Here in Texas, we have that our constables are elected, but they do serve as the law enforcement arm of the justice of the peace in the courts. So is this there's a couple other things that I want to point out here. So Robert, one of the things that you said is they're concerned about threats to the safety of these judges. Why couldn't you just have law enforcement guarding these courthouses or some other form of federal law enforcement, or maybe even at the state level, increase the security of the courthouses and whatever else?
That's what leads me to believe that's ostensibly the point of it being said by some of these people like Swalwell, but I think that's not the true objective based on that, because they could just request more money for security, or expand the U.S. Marshal Service agents and use the U.S. Marshal Services as exist under the DOJ to do that, to expand court security, and that would not require them to move the authority over the Marshal Service from the DOJ to the courts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds a lot more like this is just an effort to take away some power and authority from the Trump Department of Justice. All right, thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on to this FBI Joint Advisory. So this is something they put out a couple days ago. They said foreign hacking groups are going after U.S. logistics and supply chains. What are the details?
So this is a joint cybersecurity advisory that, like you said, was put out recently. And they're saying that a Russian state-sponsored hacking campaign is targeting U.S. and NATO logistics and technology companies. They're saying that the main actor here is a Russian military intelligence unit called 26165. It's also known as Advanced Persistent Threat 28, or Fancy Bear. I think that's CrowdStrike's name for them. And according to this notice, they've started targeting defense ports, airports, maritime targets, and air traffic management in NATO countries, including the U.S. And this is something we've pointed out for probably 2 years now, is that U.S. supply chains are vulnerable to cyber attacks from foreign adversary-linked hackers. And from what I could find in IBM's threat assessment for 2025, the manufacturing and logistics sectors have seen a major surge in cyber attacks, especially ransomware, over the last 4 years. And I think what's probably really insidious about cyber attacks targeting U.S. manufacturing and logistics is that they don't have to be major spectacular attacks. They could be much more surreptitious, like cyber incidents that could be disguised basically as industrial accidents or routine equipment failures. And there are multiple vulnerabilities that still exist, and a major one that we pointed out, I think, in late 2023 was federal trucks. They have federally mandated mileage trackers that are actually networked. And if I remember correctly, there was a group from a university in Colorado that successfully hacked a truck because it had this mileage tracker and managed to shut the truck down. But there are other points of vulnerability that we've pointed out, like the Chinese-made ZPMC cranes that make up like 80% of the global market, including in the United States. And not only could these different parts of the U.S. supply chain be hacked and disrupted, but they could also serve as nodes for further cyber attacks on other infrastructure or other ports.
Mm-hmm. All right. Very important today. Just looking at the second and third order effects of this, we're talking about if these hacks were to be successful. Well, I guess let's back up. Did the FBI say that they were in an operational phase, like they're targeting for reconnaissance and exploitation, or reconnaissance or exploitation? I guess that's the bottom line.
Well, I think that it's both. In the exploitation side, from what I could find, is the vast majority are ransomware, which ostensibly is criminal activity, but it's because of the difficulty of attribution and the intermingling of these cyber criminal groups with state-sponsored groups. It's difficult to say for sure that a ransomware attack on a manufacturing facility that stops production for 30 days is not actually a state-sponsored group. And it would have, I think, the intended effect of disrupting U.S. manufacturing and supply chains if, something like a shipping agent or a manufacturing facility for drones or something like that is hit with a ransomware attack. That would have the intended effect of disrupting U.S. supply chains for key technologies, defense technologies, consumer goods.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that, Robert. Let's go ahead and move on. Down to Mexico, there's been a lot of talk about this pharmaceutical industry there, is a suitable replacement for drugs that we get currently from China and India. I guess, Jared, the biggest problem for Mexican pharmaceuticals is the precursor chemicals still come from China and maybe India.
Yes.
That problem aside, what's the update here?
Okay. So a member of their Ministry of Economy, he says he wants to grow this industry threefold in the next 5 years, or sorry, these industries, pharmaceuticals and the medical industries. And this is in pursuit of the Plan Mexico that Claudia Sheinbaum has been touting for several months now. And he said the Mexican government will announce in the next few days additional tax incentives and a broader strategy overall on how they plan to achieve this. So I'll be keeping an eye out for this. As you mentioned, most of the precursor chemicals come from China and India, but we've covered, I think it was a month ago now, there have been all kinds of quality control issues with those. So there is a large effort, both strategically and just for getting quality chemicals back over here to reshore it, friendshore it, nearshore it, whatever you want to call it. That would make this almost as important for the United States as it is for Mexico, depending on how much there could be investing. Now, I believe it was the Marcelo Ebrard, the economy secretary, he said that he expects a renegotiation of the USMCA, the free trade agreement between United States, Mexico, and Canada. I think there's going to be a lot of talk about this particular aspect here. And the reason for that is that if America can get midstream material like precursor chemicals or medical use electronics, then made here in Mexico, then that would fit the reshoring efforts, that would fit the Fortress North America overall strategy. It would help stabilize our neighbor a fair amount. You mentioned previously that there's some debate on whether or not Mexico could be considered a failed state. This would also remove economic factors for migration, helping that. It seems like this is ripe for being pressed on for actual investment and job creation inside of Mexico, and the Mexican government is very, very interested in doing this.
Right. Yeah, I would still be concerned. Just we look at Mexico as a proxy for Chinese gray zone warfare, just in terms of fentanyl production, transnational criminal organizations. If you're basically, sometimes I get asked, oh, Mike, my son is about to graduate high school or graduate college. I don't know what, should he join the military? I mean, I can't tell you if he should join the military or not, but counterintelligence is going to be it is, and it will continue to be a job that's in huge demand. And frankly, if you're a Chinese official, military official, looking for other avenues for gray zone warfare against the United States, pharmaceutical manufacturing, Mexico is on that list somewhere. All right. Thanks for that, Jared. And we will get to your questions here, but just a quick admin note. Monday, the 26th of May is Memorial Day. So the early warning team will be observing that national holiday. We will not be producing a report, obviously no live stream on Monday, but we will be back on Tuesday. And so we are going to get to questions now, but before then, we do hope you have a solemn but otherwise happy weekend. And with that, let's get into your questions. Is there actual evidence of the wastewater leaks from the fracked wells? It sounds more like competing wells don't want their oil to spill over into other channels. I don't know. Robert?
Yeah, from what I understand, so I just wanted to make sure that I clarified that these are breaching old oil wells. So basically the ground pressure from the wastewater is high enough that it's breaching these old wells and spraying, according to the Railroad Commission, spraying this wastewater up into the air with the potential to contaminate drinking water. So as far as reading through the report, I haven't seen yet that there's some major incident where it has contaminated groundwater, actual potable water. But that's why they're, I think, releasing this warning. And what they're doing is also expanding when they're talking about how they have to survey these old wells a half mile away. That's actually expanding the radius they have to make sure that they're not breaching these old wells and having that wastewater potentially contaminate groundwater.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks for that. Could the problems at the Newark airport be cyber attacks? I mean, yeah, I think they could. I think people tend to look at airport problems in Newark and say, well, it's just classic Newark incompetence, which obviously can't be ruled out. Robert, I would think if they are cyber attacks, we would have heard something by now. I could be wrong. What say you?
Well, yeah, there's the potential they could be, and that's really what I was pointing at with this, this idea that they could conduct attacks that look like industrial accidents, or look like, in this case,
Sure.
Equipment failure. Like I think at the Newark airport, it was a radio failure, and yeah, they could look like that, and then that makes it difficult to say without basically a cyber forensic analysis if it was a cyber attack or not.
All right. Any more questions, Jared? All right. Why can't the U.S. get addiction under control to decrease cartel power? I don't know, man. That's above my pay grade. I think the insatiable demand for drugs really is the center of gravity for most of these cartels that do make millions, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars from drug trafficking. If you could get the drug demand, the demand for illicit drugs under control, then you could essentially have you could attack the center of gravity for all the money making. Because when the cartels don't have money, they can't buy guns, they can't pay members, they can't bribe politicians, they can't do a lot of things. So it wouldn't ruin the cartels, but they certainly would be forced into other ways to make money, which is what they've also been doing over the past many years now. So why can't the U.S. get addiction under control? I don't know, man. Couldn't tell you. Wouldn't there be a concern of meds laced with fentanyl if we got them from Mexico? 100%. We know they have the fentanyl labs down there. That was my point exactly about a potential vector for gray zone warfare against the United States. So, yeah, frankly, it would be a concern of mine.
All right, that's caught up on the live stream. We did have one from the Early Warning Network. This was from a member over there. Long and short of it is, why is the gold-silver ratio widening instead of closing? Because he watched it go from 80 to up over 100 instead of dropping down close to the 30 like was predicted.
I'm the wrong guy to ask.
Okay. Oh, had a couple.
I mean, I think that one of the big reasons is just because demand for gold is far above normal. China's been buying gold for something like, 15 or 18 months straight. I talked about that Deutsche Bank report. Some Deutsche Bank asset managers went over to China, and they visited with a bunch of clients, and they said every single meeting that we've had with our Chinese clients, we have been asked how to buy more physical gold. How do you buy more physical gold? So I think that's probably one of the big reasons. There's just a lot more demand for gold than there is silver right now. Most demand for silver is industrial. So when you have an economic slowdown, you have declining demand for silver. But I don't know. I mean, considering how much silver is used in electronics and defense munitions, I don't know why the ratio is so low. I mean, I guess a lot of people would say that the price of silver is being manipulated. I don't know.
All right. We had a couple more come in.
All right. How do you think that the Big Beautiful Bill Act, or the Big Beautiful Bill passing the House, will affect the deficit in our economy? I've seen estimates that it will increase the federal deficit by like 3 to 5 trillion or something like that over the next 10 years. It is obviously going to expand the deficit. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been very clear, and even the Trump administration said this during the first Trump administration. You have to grow your way out of the national debt situation. There's a debt to GDP ratio that Scott Bessent says is what really matters. He says the absolute total debt totals don't matter as much as that debt to GDP ratio. And as it stands right now, the U.S. debt to GDP ratio is somewhere like 120, 125%. If they can use this bill to grow the economy, to have this economic growth that they are promising, if that works out, then our debt to GDP ratio goes down as our economy is growing faster than the debt. If they fail to produce this economic growth, then our debt to GDP ratio goes up. anything over 90 or 100 typically leads to a financial crisis. Somewhere between 130 to 150 is considered the point of no return. We're at like 120, 125 right now. That being said, Japan is at 265% debt to GDP ratio, and their carousel has not ended yet. But listen, it's pretty clear. We're headed towards a major sovereign debt crisis. It is going to happen. It could be conceivably, maybe it could be 20 years from now, 5-10 years from now. It could be 5 to 10 months from now, 5 to 10 days. I don't know. But when I see treasury yields go up like they have been, and Japanese bonds, I mean, Japan launched a 40-year bond in the past couple of years or something like that. So listen, at a certain point, you're going to be an investor, and you're just going to say, I don't have enough faith that I'm going to get 100% of my money back on a 30-year treasury. And I think people will be forced to take a haircut. There will, I think, obviously be some form of debt restructuring. The question is that going to be an orderly process or a disorderly process? I don't know the answer to that question, but it will hit eventually. But I don't know when. So I think that's the biggest thing, is that the Trump administration is trying to grow the economy faster than the debt, bring yields down that makes borrowing costs go down, and try to rebalance, or otherwise attempt to at some point in the future restructure all this debt. Honestly, I think everyone's taking a haircut. I think these governments that are so deeply indebted, I don't think it'll go to zero in many cases. But frankly, if I'm a big bondholder, I would kind of be prepared for the federal government or for the Treasury to come to me and say at some point in the future, you're not going to get 100% of your money back, but you're going to get like 70 or 80% back. And at the point that the Treasury has to do that, we're probably going to see a lot of investments go down much farther. So you may be happy that you're getting 70, 80% of your money back from bonds after they mature, as opposed to equities where you could easily lose 50% or more. That's my take. I hope that answers your question. Any other questions? All right. What are the chances of Congress creating police bodies outside the executive branch and having government officers arresting each other leads to civil conflict? I would just say in general, pretty low. I don't know. Robert, is there any desire by members in Congress to create additional law enforcement bodies?
Not that I've seen. In basically over the last 2 years, or well, really during the Biden administration, they were expanding the Capitol Police and building Capitol Police headquarters in the states. That's been the path to expanding law enforcement from Congress. I haven't seen them creating new agencies, and like you said, I think the likelihood of civil conflict over it is low, but it does create more disruption and discord within the federal government, basically lowering, I think, the capacity for the government to actually do anything. And that's part of the point, I think, of moving the U.S. or the idea of moving the U.S. Marshal Service under the judicial branch is another way to hamstring the White House, to hamstring the president, in order to stop them from doing things, not necessarily just to mass arrest the Trump administration.
All right. Next question. China's the origin for fentanyl, as I understand it. I don't know about that. I'm almost certain there are fentanyl labs in Mexico. This is not something I follow day to day. Jared, Robert, haven't we? I mean, didn't the Mexico government just brag a couple weeks ago that they blew up a bunch of drug labs, and like fentanyl labs included in there?
You're muted, Jared.
Sorry. They were talking about that back in, I think, January. And China's the main one. It's not the only origin for fentanyl. India consistently shows up as number 2. They are always pushing fentanyl precursors over to Mexico and Canada. That has a whole that's a whole can of worms to really dive into. But yes, India is one as well. And there was a press that was destroyed in El Paso, I believe it was, 2 weeks ago. Yep, that was Chinese owned, smuggled, operated, pushing out fake, entirely fentanyl pills.
Well, I think Mexico and Canada as a threat aren't necessarily because they're the origin of fentanyl, but because they're an easy pass through. So you necessarily because there are less restrictions on imports from Mexico and Canada because we're under the USMCA, the U.S. Mexico Canada Agreement, formerly known as the North American Free Trade Agreement. And Canada is, I think, kind of slept on as a threat for fentanyl just because the border is not as tightly controlled. It's much more expansive geographically, and it's much more difficult to detect it coming across the border. And from what I understand, there are many fentanyl labs that are being discovered and rolled up by Canadian law enforcement. So Canada is also a major vector for that fentanyl importation in the United States.
Yeah, that's actually certainly worth noting. Canada experiences a lot of the same issues we do, just on a smaller scale, where I don't think I've seen Mexico talk too much about it aside from just being the pass through. I don't, Mike, you'd probably know better than me, but I don't think I've seen an opioid crisis burgeoning in Mexico.
Yeah, I don't know. Couldn't tell you. All right, what do you think about the Secret Service removing the ability of Harvard to enroll foreign students? And do you think this will withstand the courts? I don't know. Let's take the courts first. Briefly, Robert, it's going to be challenged at some level, I'm sure. As the team's chief court watcher, briefly, what say you?
I think we're going to see exactly the same thing that's been going on with the district level court. Whoever sues over this, Harvard or law firm that they get, or even a nonprofit or whatever related to Harvard is going to sue, and a district court that's favorable to them, and they're going to block it. They're going to put an injunction on it.
Yeah. So this really looks like here's one of the fundamental problems that we have in this country is that Harvard and Columbia and Yale and all these other schools, MIT, Stanford, et cetera, they make so much money, so much more money from foreign students due to foreign tuition rates than they do our own American students. So I think that's a big problem. And then there are a lot of people that say, oh yeah, we take in the nation's best students, and then they come and they take our, they get the best jobs. And then you really start to wonder why foreign immigrants have higher rates of success. And maybe it's because they're getting into better schools, and then they're graduating and getting better jobs, and now they have higher lifetime earning than Americans who would otherwise be taking those seats in classes and getting those degrees and getting those jobs. I don't know. I think this is a major problem, and it's misaligned incentives. This is ultimately, I think this is a form, Michael Every talks about economic statecraft, and that's where you use policy to grow your country's economic power. It's a much more involved process to use the levers of economic policy for national security and national power. And I think, I don't know, maybe Trump really is going after Harvard for for whatever reasons, but this really does seem to be like it's an attempt to hit Harvard's pocketbook. Otherwise, I would very much welcome some policy where our country's universities help the country, help Americans more than they do help foreigners. Robert, briefly, any response?
Yeah, I think that helping foreigners can be much more direct in that this is a major vector for espionage. And it's not just even these Ivy League schools or these, prestigious level schools. I went to Texas A&M for my master's degree from the Bush School, and there were many foreign students at the Bush School, and rumors went around that they were connected to foreign intelligence services, and that even the faculty knew that. And at least once, a foreign exchange student was caught taking photographs of sign-up sheets for federal agency recruiting events. And so this is a major vector for espionage that, beyond getting foreigners into U.S. universities where they have the best job prospects, it also is, I think, serving as a vector for a major level of espionage against the United States.
Mm-hmm. All right. A very fair point. Let's see. We have time for a couple more questions here. I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to get to all of them. How would a government debt restructuring affect those with student loans? I don't know. In that case, the debt is not. It's not government debt. It's student debt. So I don't know. Greater enforcement of people who have federal student loans. I'm not sure. Let's see. Doge can recommend spending cuts, but can you clarify the process of actually reducing the spending? Executive orders, or does it require congressional approval? Robert, I think that's one of the chief complaints here is that Congress has not passed a law to put the Doge spending cuts into the federal law, or however that works. How does that work?
Yeah, they're actually cementing these cuts and hopefully avoiding the courts just saying, no, you can't stop spending this money would require an act of Congress. And that's due to the Impoundment Act. Basically, the president can't, according to legislation, or the most prevalent interpretation of the legislation is the president cannot block the spending of money that's already been appropriated by Congress. So to actually cut that spending requires a bill.
Mm-hmm. All right, makes sense to me. All right, this is the last question we'll take for today. Do you see the Fed moving rates down pre-midterm, or is it just political tool at this point? Well, in terms of a political tool, that was Trump's big complaint when I think the Fed cut in September of 2024, just a couple months before the election. And so whether that juiced the economy, maybe in favor of Biden, I don't know. I couldn't tell you, but that was the complaint by Donald Trump. Most of what I've seen so far is that the Fed has not cut rates. There's two reasons why the Fed has not cut rates. Number one is because actually the hard data for the economy is actually looking pretty good. And I know this is as the government calculates this stuff. We know the unemployment rate is much higher than the official unemployment rate. We get it. And inflation has been much higher than how it's been calculated. We know. But in terms of those numbers, I do think they fairly accurately measure whether things are going up or things are going down, as long as the bottom line numbers are calculated in the same way. So the first thing is that hard economic data has looked much better than the soft data. Number one. Number two, the Fed is still concerned about inflation. Actually, you know what? Let me tell you, this will be in my economic early warning report later today. But Jamie Dimon was just he was in Shanghai because JP Morgan had the JP Morgan Global China Summit in China. So he was interviewed and he said, quote, "We have to be prepared for something like stagflation." He says, quote, "I think global fiscal deficits are inflationary. I think the remilitarization of the world is inflationary. The restructuring of trade or global trade is inflationary. The infrastructure needs are inflationary." And so I think there's just a lot of expectations that inflation will start to go back up, number one. So I think that's the biggest reason why the Fed has not cut. That said, I still think a lot of this too also probably has to do with GDP expectations and recession expectations. If recession expectations or the likelihood of recession goes up, the Fed is more likely to consider cuts. If not, they're less likely to do that. I think most banks are probably not expecting it. If they do, maybe later this fall or next year. So yeah, maybe before the midterms, maybe you get a cut, but probably not talking about a large cut unless there's just some like massive financial crisis where they have to cut very steeply. I think most banks are still looking at probably like a 0.25% cut and just a gradual reduction in interest rates. So I hope that answers your question. All this, of course, is subject to change. By the way, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, some of these other, JP Morgan I think they had like a 60% chance of recession just a couple of weeks ago. Goldman Sachs lowered their 12-month recession likelihood from 45% down to 35%. So that U.S.-China tariff pause was far more optimistic than what had been previously expected. So we'll see if we get we'll see about these big, beautiful trade deals that are supposed to happen. Scott Bessent said he's optimistic that most of them can get hammered out by the end of the year, which is still 6 months away. So, all right, everyone, that's going to do it for today's briefing. It's also going to wrap up this week. Just a reminder again, Monday is Memorial Day, so we will be observing that national holiday. We will not be here on Monday. If you show up, I hope you have a good morning. We'll be back on Tuesday morning, back in your inboxes, back on the show starting at 08 Central Time. Thanks so much for the support. Thank you for watching. And until next time, be well and stay out front.